More than 2.5 trillion euros. That is the sum of German debt right now. And what if it's not enough? Is Germany taking on too little debt? This is a debate happening in this country at this moment. Some sectors are crying out for cash. The military, the country's mediocre digital infrastructure, railways. Did I mention climate change? The economy, meanwhile, is struggling to compete. Calls are now growing to abolish or amend the strict debt rules chiseled into the country's constitution. But fans of those rules aren't backing down. They say piling on the debt would burden future generations. So what exactly is Germany's debt problem? Too little or too much? First of all, Germany has a lot of debt. In real terms, at least. Even when you look at debt in relation to the size of the economy, and that's really the standard comparison between countries, it's hardly among the lowest. And Germany has done a good bit of spending on credit in recent years. In fact, proudly so. Just go back to the pandemic. The finance minister at the time, a guy named Olaf Scholz, boasted of his country's financial firepower. Literally, he said he was unleashing a bazooka to help save households. But then, what country didn't take on debt during the pandemic? That crisis is now over. But other crises have begun or grown worse. A war, inflation, an expensive climate transition. And that former finance minister, he's now head of the country, the chancellor. But that bazooka is nowhere to be seen. Germany now says its budget for this year will return to stricter spending rules. Those rules limit the deficit in any budget year to just over 0.3% of GDP. And that makes Germany an outlier. Italy plans a new budget deficit of around 4%. France, about the same. Okay, granted, those are both countries that tend to run deficits. But even the Netherlands, a fiscal hawk within the EU, and a country that has aimed for balanced budgets recently, is expected to run deficits for the coming years, citing growing social expenses. Now, critics say Germany shouldn't fear running deficits, especially when the country's needs are so high. But we'll get to their arguments in a moment. First, why is a balanced budget so important to Germany? Now, you may ask, why wouldn't it be? From our own personal finances, we know that we can't spend more than we have, at least consistently. National budgets are different from household budgets, of course, but we also know that there are plenty of governments overwhelmed by debt. The more debt you have, the more of your income you spend paying it down, which leaves less space in your budget for other priorities. And debt has become more expensive. That's because interest rates have risen. So the more borrowing a government does, the more expensive it gets. Remember, Germany is in a pretty good position. Its debt relative to the size of its economy is below the EU average. That makes borrowing new money cheaper, because the risk of Germany missing payments is clearly lower than countries with massive debt piles. It also leaves future governments and taxpayers with less to pay down. So the thinking goes. But it's more than just fiscal prudence at play here. Keeping down debt has turned into something of a political mantra in Germany. Critics would say that it too often goes unquestioned. Now, one could point to German history for a possible reason. German debts after World War I, as dictated in the Versailles Treaty, were massive, and they created both anger and anxiety. The country defaulted on reparations, fueling political uncertainty. Fun fact, Germany finally paid off its final debt from the First World War in 2010, more than 90 years after Versailles. Other crises reinforced Germany's desire to keep its financial affairs in order, such as the Great Recession in 2008. It forced countries to pile onto their debt loads. Deficits ballooned across the EU as revenues fell and spending grew. That led to the Euro crisis, which cast new light on the financial health of European countries. EU members ultimately agreed to tighten guidelines on annual deficits and debts, but in reality, few of them took those goals seriously. Germany, however, was dead serious. It wanted to control growing debt in the EU, but also at home. By 2010, total federal debt had reached 82% of the country's GDP. Now that's almost 18 percentage points higher than it was before the recession. German states, meanwhile, had their own debt problems. So, Berlin encouraged fiscal discipline, domestically and beyond its own borders. Now, saving the euro ultimately needed stronger medicine, massive bailouts. But at home, that message of discipline, fiscal discipline, it resonated. The German parliament changed the constitution in 2009 to essentially require balanced budgets, both at the federal and at the state level. There were exceptions to this rule, which we'll touch on in a moment. But Germany didn't need them right away. In fact, in the first two budgets after that new debt rule entered effect, Berlin ran balanced budgets. Then it ran surpluses. The economy was booming. Borrowing rates were quite low at the time, but many finance ministers relished the art of saying no to new deficit spending. Angela Merkel praised the symbol of the Swabian housewife, a mythical southern German who keeps tight control of her purse strings. The Schwarze Null, the Black Zero, the symbol of a balanced budget, became a kind of seal of fiscal prudence for both state and federal governments. And the debt brake, it ultimately worked as intended. Debt fell faster in Germany than in the rest of the EU. And then came the pandemic. Again, everyone took on debt during the pandemic, Germany included. And in fact, the debt brake also allowed it, with a special emergency provision. The real question was what came next. It's important to point out that not everyone loved the debt brake when the German parliament was discussing it. Some economists, frankly, found it misguided. National economies are different from an actual household. Governments can choose to invest money to make long-term improvements that will pay off over time. They can spur business, which increases overall economic activity and improves well-being. It could be bridges, it could be schools, it could be climate infrastructure. In fact, a vocal number of economists and policymakers came out of the Great Recession with a starkly different opinion than German leaders. The governments needed to spend more, not less. One example was Portugal. It cast off austerity measures in 2015 and spurred its economy by spending more. Finally, many critics say that German debt was never that high to begin with. A possible default was never even realistic. But for many of these critics, the post-pandemic situation in Germany has only made the case stronger for spending more. Inflation and the war in Ukraine put households and businesses into difficult positions. Trade with China slowed. Manufacturing fell. Business confidence slid. Growth slipped. Germany was becoming less attractive for new investment, especially as the US and China spent big, for example, on industrial subsidies. Forecasters say German growth will be underwhelming through 2028 without intervention, and that it could even fall behind comparable economies. And the lack of German investments over past years suddenly became glaringly apparent. In schools and education, where infrastructure was deteriorating and the profession becoming less attractive. In digital infrastructure, where Germany was struggling to roll out the most modern internet connections. And in its own military, which observers had warned for years was being underfunded. Addressing some of those needs is almost impossible to imagine without taking on considerable new debt. According to one study, almost 400 billion euros in new mobility infrastructure is needed by 2030. That's bridges, streets, rails. Even broken up across several years, that's a massive amount of money, thanks in large part to underspending in past years. Now, Berlin did take on new debt to equip its military. But as finances grew tighter, the new government tried something of a budget trick. It tried to redirect debt taken out for the corona pandemic into already planned expenses, some 60 billion euros. A court ultimately shot it down, so the government has turned to budget cuts. But is that the right decision for an economy that's performing poorly? Should Germany take on debt to fill its budget hole? Should it reassess its overall attitude toward debt, given the shape of its economy and the backlog of investments? Again, the debt brake is back in place for 2024. And there's already a hole in finances for the coming years. Budget cuts aren't easy. In fact, the removal of a popular diesel subsidy led to a massive series of farmer protests earlier this year. But the finance minister is betting that Germans today still want tight fiscal discipline. And in some ways, he doesn't appear to be wrong. In fact, polls show that a majority of Germans oppose an abolishment of the debt brake. The experts, meanwhile, are split. One survey of almost 200 economists found that roughly half wanted the debt brake to remain as it is, while the other half either wants it reformed or completely abolished. Another group, the German Council of Economic Experts, which advises the government, has called for reforms. For example, there could be a transition period for coming out of an emergency phase, such as the pandemic, or that the permissible amount of deficit spending could be tied to the amount of overall outstanding debt. In other words, a lower debt load would then allow higher deficits. Companies, meanwhile, say they want more investment help from the government in general, investments that some experts say is unlikely without a loosening of the debt brake. One thing is clear, Germany's approach to debt is rather unique for a major economy. Debt levels have soared in recent years in the US, China, and Japan, and Germany stands out in the EU, where many countries are continuing with deficit spending in the years ahead. Some, like the Netherlands, in a shift away from recent practice. Can Germany, with its aging population and its investment backlogs, really stick to its budget rule? Is it realistic? Something we'll be keeping an eye on. Thanks for watching.